Hello and welcome back to this short series of videos looking at how I'm setting up this new Japanese plane. So in this video I'm going to be focusing on the ironmongery, the chip breaker and the blade. To start with, I'm going to be working on the backs. I need to make sure they're perfectly flat. You can never get a good sharp edge here unless the back is flat, and this chip breaker needs to mate perfectly with the blade itself. So both those faces need to be perfectly flat, otherwise you get chips of wood wedged between the chip breaker and the blade, and then that's just a mess. You have to take all that out, clean it out and have another go. So getting those two surfaces so that they fit perfectly, that's really important. So on to the back, and I'm going to start on a lapping plate. Doesn't really matter what you use to flatten the back, but I'm going to start with a lapping plate and some grit. I'm using a 600 grit. It's quite fine for this job. You could start with something a bit more coarse, maybe 400, and as you work it, that grit will break down anyway, but I don't want to take too much material off of this if I can avoid it, so that seems to work fine for me. So let's take a close look at the back of this blade. So this may be a little bit tricky to show on the camera. It depends on the light and the angles here, but as I mentioned on the previous video, the back of these blades is hollow ground. So this is very hard steel. So this hollow grind means that you don't have to spend forever trying to flatten the backs. You're only really interested in this little bit along the front here. This land around the outside is known as the ura, and you try to keep that fairly small. I mean, if you look at some old blades, they will have a large land here, and I think it would be considered rather bad form if I start this flattening and end up with a big fat area here that's been flattened. Unlike a chisel, where you might want to flatten the back of the blade so that you've got a good registration surface, it's not required for a plane. So we only really need this to be flat just across the front. Now, I don't know if this will show on the camera, but just looking along the blade here, I mean, it has been polished. It's had a couple of different grits on it, and I can see some areas that are a little bit dull. So there's an area here that looks dull. I think the shiny material may just about go to that corner, but there's definitely a patch here, and that is indicating that this is going to be a low spot. So whatever grit they finished this preliminary grinding with, that did not touch this area. This looks to be a coarser grit. So there's another patch over here. Now that is almost certainly well out of our way, so I'm not too concerned about that. And I think there might be a bit of a low spot here. Now that one potentially could be a bit of a problem. So it's worth just taking a moment to assess the blade and see what sort of work may be needed. So what I'm going to do, when I start the lapping, I'm not going to do much work at all before I start looking at the scratch pattern and seeing where I'm removing material. Because as I mentioned, I don't want this to get ground back too much in order to flatten this. Now, there is another way to deal with this. I mean, if you've got a low spot, you've got to get rid of it. And you can do it either by grinding away the high area. So if this is a low spot, I'd need to grind away this material and all of this material until we get this in one plane. That could be quite a lot of work. The other option, and this is known as uradashi or tapping out is to use a hammer, place the blade on an anvil or some other support, and use a hammer to strike the soft iron backing of the blade along this area here, wherever the low spot is, and that will bit by bit deform this soft iron or soft steel here, and cause the hard material below to be deflected. You're not whacking it, you're just tapping it gently and as precisely as possible. The last thing you want to do is strike too near to this hard steel. There's danger of chipping or cracking, and that would be a problem. But we could gently work an area of this blade here to press this material down, and that then will translate on this side to raising that material, and hopefully if you do that correctly you can save yourself a bit of grinding. So the first job here is to start the grinding and take a look at the scratch pattern and assess what work needs to be done. Now, just looking at this blade in general, I mean, this is a modest quality blade. It's not the not the highest tier for sure, but it should be a reasonable blade. It's blue paper steel, but I can see it has some issues. This almost certainly won't show up on the camera, but I can see there are, I don't know if those are, it could just be burrs or some small damage to the very edge of the plane along here. Another one there. I think the ura on the back, it's just a wee bit rough in places, the grinding there. I mean, it's not bad. It will undoubtedly be perfectly fine. But if I show you a slightly better blade, then I think the difference might be clear. So this blade is this is a blue super blade. Now this one is certainly a better quality blade. The material's different, so we've got this is rather more shiny here where it's been ground, but hopefully you can see that this ura here, it's rather finer. I don't see any of those low spots that I can see on the other blade. This looks like it's been ground pretty well to start with, and this is very finely and accurately done. I mean, this work is done by hand, so every blade will be slightly different, but this has been crafted beautifully, and this is a very fine job. And that means that blade, when I get to it, should require a little less work than this one. And you can see, I think, the difference between the two. So first job is to start lapping the back here and just see what's going on with the scratch pattern. Right, so I've got a lapping plate here. I think in Japan they would call this a kanna. Got a little bit of this powder. As I said, that's a 600 grit, so that is quite fine. I don't need too much of it. Start with that, and just a couple of drops of water to get that started. So I'm really only interested in this bit across the front. However, I don't just want to sit on the edge here and grind away, because I'll start to make a little step. So I will work this front portion, but with the focus along the front, and of course the weight on the front. Definitely don't want to lift the blade whilst doing it. There's always a danger of doing that, and then you end up putting a bevel here. That would be extremely difficult to get rid of. You'd probably have to grind away from this side in order to remove that bevel. So it's really important not to lift this up. But on the other hand, I need to get weight here, which does mean that I need to just support the weight of it, and then all the pressure is going to come on these fingers here. So just right. So I haven't done much there, but already I want to just take a look and see where I'm getting some scratches. And see whether I'm going to need to tap out this blade or not. So if I can bring that a little bit closer, straight away I can see actually that my concerns over this area, I didn't need to be too worried about that. That is actually fine. We've got the scratches along here and then along here. So that's all good. What we've got is a very fine line running the length of the blade, and it's a little bit wider here. So all of this material that's been scratched, that's a little bit high, but we're not miles away from, I think, getting this fairly flat. So I'm going to do this, I think, without tapping out the blade at all. I think a little bit of grinding. I mean, I've only put a few strokes on there just to get this scratch pattern. It only takes a few to be able to see what's happening. But I think just a little bit of lapping and I'll be able to get right up to the very front edge of this blade. So this area here is just a little bit low, and yeah, I could fix that by tapping out here. This is also the area that shows some sort of damage on the front. I really can't, I'm not entirely sure what that is. I think that's possibly some sort of impact damage in storage here that has just rolled that very front edge. I think I will be getting rid of that when I work this bevel on the water stones later. So just occasionally a drop of water. Don't want that slurry to dry out. So after just a little bit more lapping there, this scratch pattern proceeds to about here before we start to get that very fine line across. The blade actually, with just a little bit of lapping, we've got a fairly consistent scratch pattern down to here. So that hollow has already been taken out. That must have been just very slight. On this other side, actually there are little hollow bands here, here, and then further down. I'm not too worried about those. They're a long way from this edge, so it'll be a long time before I have to deal with any hollows here. But this line here, if you just get the light right and sight along the very edge, then this line will reveal itself, and it's a taper that goes from about here, and I don't know how wide that is, maybe 1/3 of a millimeter at the moment. So I'll continue. I think I'm not enlarging this too much. I will continue for a little bit longer on the lapping plate, see if I can get rid of that. So as that grit has broken down, it has left a beautifully polished surface now along the whole of the front here. I'm quite happy with this. I don't think I've substantially increased the size of the ewer from what I started with, just a little bit in the corners here. Those low points that I spotted earlier on, they're mostly gone. There's just a little bit left here. It'll be a long time before I have to deal with that. So this here is very nice now, very polished. I won't touch that until the very last minute, just to take the burr off on my very finest stone. On this side, yeah, there's a burr I can feel along here, of course, and that will be dealt with shortly. Now, while I've got the lapping plate out, I'm going to tackle the chip breaker. Now, it's absolutely crucial that these two surfaces mate as best they can, so this also has to be flat. Now, this is a laminated chip breaker. They're not always on some of the cheaper planes. It might just be a piece of hardened and tempered steel, but this is laminated, so this stuff here will be fairly hard as well. And I'm going to give that exactly the same treatment. The bevel, when I come to it, that doesn't need the same degree of attention as the bevel on the blade. And there's another bevel angle across the front which I will retain, and that is steeper than you'd have on a cutting edge. This is not a cutting edge, of course. This is just to prevent the tear out, so that is a rather different beast. But I'm going to go across the back in exactly the same way and get that nice and flat. Now, with these, there is sometimes a bit of a curve here because these ears have been just crudely bent over with a hammer against the anvil. So this is not flat on the back that far. So I don't want to bring this in here because I'll start rolling over this front edge. So I'm only going to work just the first, I don't know, maybe centimetre and a half. I think this chip breaker is actually flatter, if anything, than the blade. Just a few strokes on the lapping plate there, and I've got a fairly consistent scratch pattern across most of the blade. Just missing the very tip of the corner there, and just a tiny amount along the front edge here and here. I think that will soon be dealt with, so I'm very happy with the state of the chip breaker. They often look a little bit rough and ready, which they are, but the main point is that this piece here is already pretty flat, so I'm very happy with that. So I'm not quite finished with the chip breaker here yet, but one thing that's good to do is if you put those two together, obviously so that the flattened portions right at the end are touching, this should now sit perfectly together. So now if you hold this up to the light and look through the gap here, you shouldn't be able to see any light shining through, and light will shine through a very narrow slit indeed. And I can see I've got just a little bit more work to do on this to get this perfect, but that's a quick and easy test to make sure that these are both perfectly flat. So I'm happy now with the condition of the chip breaker. It mates very nicely with the back of the blade, and I've got a nice mirror polish along this front edge. So that's all the work that I'm going to do on the kanna. So I'll give that a quick clean and put that away. I'm going to move on to waterstones for the bevel of the blade, and I'll give a bit of attention to the bevel of the chip breaker as well. Now, of course, there are lots of different ways of going about sharpening. I am by no means an expert on this. I'm just sharing a method that has worked for me in the past, and this is just how I'm doing it right now. Perhaps if I revisit this in a year's time, then I might be using a different method for sharpening. Who knows? But anyway, this is just how I'm approaching it, and as I say, it has worked in the past, and we will see how well it works this time. So I've got 3 water stones, 1000, 3000 and 6000 grit. They're just ordinary water stones. The 1000 is fairly soft, it needs to be flattened quite frequently. And then I've got a 12,000 ceramic stone. That one is very nice. It doesn't wear very quickly, but it cuts surprisingly fast for such a fine finish. That is the only stone now that will see the back of the chip breaker or the blade. To now put that finely polished surface on one of those other stones would ruin it. But I'm going to walk up through those grits on the bevel side. The water stones, they need to be soaked for about a minute, 2 at the most. The ceramic stone is a splash and go sort, so I will get on with that. So before I start working on the bevel, it's worth talking about camber just a little bit. So this is probably best done with an illustration. So if this is your blade, and we have that square, when you take a shaving, you're going to leave square edges, referred to as tram lines, and you don't really want to leave those on the board. Obviously this is very small, this step, but if you're taking a deep shaving, they can be very noticeable, and certainly not what you want if you're trying to finish the surface with the plane. So what you would normally do is put some camber on the blade. Now that camber varies depending on the purpose of the plane. So if it's taking a really deep cut, so if it's a scrub plane and you're taking a very deep cut of material, then that camber would be quite large. If it's a smoothing finishing plane, then that shaving might be quite thin, and therefore the camber can be minimal. So what you would look for really is that camber to match the depth of shaving you're looking to take. So on this illustration, it would be about that deep, and you would feather out the blade appropriately in some sort of arc like that, and that way, instead of taking this notch, you will take out a scoop. And on a scrub plane, these are obviously very, very noticeable, but on a fine cut from a smoothing plane, you don't notice this at all. There are times when the blade wants to be completely square, so if you're using the plane on a shooting board, you don't want any camber on it. If it's a rebate plane and you've got to get it into the corner of a piece of a joint, so you've got a rebate of some sort, and you want to get right down into that corner with it. Obviously, you don't want any curve on the blade there. For me, this is a smoothing plane. I intend to take quite thin shavings with it. So all I'm going to do is come across straight, and I will just, let me rub that away. So in my case, this is for a smoothing plane. So I'm going to come down with the blade. I'm going to come across flat, and then just at the ends, I just want to feather that out slightly. And I'm not looking to take much off here. I don't want a prominent camber on this blade. I will each time I go up through the stones, I will flatten across the bevel in the usual way, and then at the end I will give half a dozen strokes with the pressure on each side, and that will hopefully give me enough. Now in use, if I do see any tram lines on the wood, I can always come back and put just a little bit more camber on it. But to start with, I want to keep this fairly straight across the front and then just give it a little bit extra on those corners just to feather out that cut. Right, I've just dropped that in a tub of water just for, well, not even a minute. You know if you've done it enough, because if you take it out too early, that surface will dry instantly. It doesn't need long. These are not the sort of stones that need to be soaking for very long. What they do need is a good flattening. And if you're at all concerned whether this is or isn't flat, you can always mark it with some pencil and then work at it until all those pencil lines are gone. Oh, there we go. That is a pretty flat stone. But this one is rather soft, so I will have to revisit that regularly. So I want to keep plenty of moisture on the top here. You can do this in a variety of ways. Some people have the blade this sort of orientation. Actually, this is quite a wide blade for this stone. That would be rather tricky. It's got such a big flat on it that it's not hard to find the correct bevel. I tend to keep these fairly square that way, and if you're new to it, small movements are a good idea. Working across the whole of the stone, you'll get somewhat quicker cutting if you work the length of the stone, but only do that if you're confident that you can keep your hands in the right position. The more movement you have coming from your body rather than from your hands themselves, that is going to help steady everything up. Otherwise, it's just a case of just taking the weight here, finding the edge, putting all the pressure here, and just working away at that bevel. And it is important to keep that pressure on the front, because this soft iron at the back will abrade very quickly, whereas this hard steel at the front, that's very much harder to grind away. So if you're not careful, you can end up taking a lot of this backing away without really touching that edge. But that's it really. I'm just going to work away at that edge, keeping the pressure on the front. And I like to check this frequently, see where I'm taking material away. Well, actually, this is a bit of a surprise. I've had this with admittedly cheaper blades where it's taken a very long time to get to this point. It does depend on the craftsman who ground this, but actually this blade is in much better condition than I thought it was. It did take a little bit of effort on the back, but on this side it's looking pretty good. What can be observed sometimes is that you'll only be hitting part of the blade, but I can see scratches all along the hard metal already. I can see I'm missing here and a little bit there, but that's in the iron backing. I don't actually care about that. I'm only interested in this. Now I've got a little bit of work to do because I can still see that slightly damaged portion of the blade here. It will not show up on the camera, but in the right light it looks like it was impacted with something. it's not going to take too long to get this looking good. And once I've got a uniform scratch pattern here from this stone, I will move up to the next one. I don't need to spend long on each stone. As soon as I see the finer scratch pattern appear uniformly across the surface, the job is done. As it happens, this must have been very nicely ground to start with. You can see that this here is curved, this front edge, and you might be a little bit worried that that reflects some kind of bow in the bevel, but it does not, because the back of these blades is hollow, and when I come to fit this blade to the die, that has to be taken into account. So because of that hollow, you will see a slight arc on this change here from this face to the bevel, but that's looking pretty good already. So I'm happy with this edge now, and that slight area with damage has been taken out. So this is perfectly fine now, and I can move on to the next stone. Before I do though, I'm going to just deal with the camber on these, just those portions there. So I will find the edge, and now I'm just going to have the pressure in this corner, just half a dozen small strokes, and then the same on the other side. The stone cuts quite fast, so it's quite possible that that will be enough. I will do the same on each stone as I go up through them, but for now that is it. And again, I'm not touching the back, not until I get to the finest stone, and then I use that to take the burr off. Right, I'm not going to show the process through all of these stones. It's exactly the same. I'm just going to wipe the grit off a little bit carefully. I don't want that grit on this stone. So this is the 3000. I'll then go to the 6000. Exactly the same process. So I'll work that bevel until I get a consistent scratch pattern. Each time it's going to become finer, slightly more polished, and then at the end, the last thing I will do is address the very slight camber I'm putting on this blade, and then that is it. So I will come back when I get to the finest stone. Well, I've worked my way through those water stones, and actually it takes very little time on the higher grits. You want to do all of your work really on that low grit, that 1000 grit or whatever stone you're using, but at one of the lower grits, because that's the one you want to use to establish the geometry here. The purpose of the higher stones is really only to remove the deeper scratches that the lower grit has left. So that is a relatively small task, and compared with, say, getting rid of chips or problems. So it really doesn't take that long on those higher grit stones to just polish up this edge. Now I'm on my highest grit here, and that just needs a quick splash, and I'll spend as much time as necessary on this one just to get that beautiful mirror polish. And I don't care how this backing looks. I'm only looking at this edge across the very front there. You can see on this stone, it shows it very clearly where the pressure was with these streaks. And that is what you want to see, that that sharp line along the very front so that you know that you're taking off that hard steel and not just the soft backing. Now I've got to be careful with this one. This does cut surprisingly fast, and I don't actually like the look of it, but it does start to polish up even this soft iron here. I'm quite happy if that stays dull and grey, but this edge is getting a nice polish on it now, and it won't be too long before that is completely polished. So now that highly polished area extends from about here to there, and that is because of the slight camber that I've put on the ends of the blade. It might seem silly, just half a dozen strokes on each stone at each end, but you can see when you start to polish this blade that that really is enough to put just a slightest camber on it. And that's all I want for this plane, because this one is a smoothing plane. I hope to be taking some nice thin shavings with it, so I'm not aiming to hog off large amounts of material with it, but I will continue here just a little bit longer, and then I will do the same thing on this stone that I did on the others, and that is to just put the pressure on either side to address those corners. Well, I'm happy with the polish on the bevel there. It's looking very nice. All I need to do now is just remove the burr on this side. Only take a few strokes. That should be it. That's looking very nice. And that should be quite sharp now. And of course the usual hair shaving test. You start looking a little bit threadbare after a while, but that is reasonably well sharpened. So I'm going to put that aside, and it's always a little bit tricky the first time you prepare the blade, but I think for now this will do, and then we'll see if there's anything more needed in use. So now I'm going to turn my attention to the bevel of the chip breaker. Now the difference here is that this doesn't have to be sharp. This is not the cutting edge. And in fact, it's got an extra bevel along the front. You may just be able to see that, this sort of line across the front. So the chip breaker, that's the main bevel. And then down the front here, there's another small bevel. This is, I don't know, maybe around 60 degrees or something. I don't actually care what angle this is at. I will follow this. The first thing I'm going to do is go through the water stones as I did for the blade, and just focus on the main bevel there, just clean that up, and then I will just go along again through those water stones, starting with the 1000 grit, and just dress that edge so that's all nice and neat, and that'll be ready to go. Again, I'm not touching the back. That is already polished beyond the level I can do with those 3 water stones. Only my finest stone would improve that, but I'm going to tidy this edge up just a little bit. It's not that critical. The most critical thing is that this sits flat on the main blade so that nothing gets stuck in there. So I finished with this chip breaker for now. The polished area, as far as this backing is concerned, does not extend all the way along. There's an area here that isn't so finely polished, and here. But the hard steel along the front is nice and clean. And that edge has been nicely cleaned up. And that's all you need for that. Chip breakers are often a little bit less refined than a blade, and of course that's to be expected. Over time this will become rather cleaner than it is right now, but it is in perfectly good condition, I think, to do the job. Now there's one thing left to fix with the ironmongery here. Now we know that these two faces at the front are flat. Now the chip breaker, as I've mentioned before, has these ears on the corners, and that holds it off from the blade here. It's also slightly tapered. Now this of course has been hand ground. These are being whacked with a hammer. So these points here, the mating of that with the blade, it's not that precise. So if you locate the chip breaker in just the right spot, just a hair behind the cutting edge, and hold it there with your finger, we know that it's mated nicely along the front, and then you can tap the corners and it is very clear that that one is touching and this one is not. Now there are a couple of things to do here. Some people will take this down, the high one, with a file. I don't really like to do that too much. I would rather adjust these ears slightly than do a lot of filing here. The other thing is that you don't want these to be too pointy. It's nice if they've got just a little flat on them. So I will just take a file to these and make sure there's a small flat on each one of these, and then I'll test it again because this one is very much more pointy. But what I like to do is adjust these by striking with a hammer. And now if you want, you can take the one that makes the racket and give that a bang. Excuse me. Support it on an anvil, or I'm going to use the end of a lump hammer and strike here and just bend that down a little bit more. Or you can do the reverse and flatten this one out slightly. Which way you go might depend slightly on how that fits in the die. Now we're not fitting the blade to the die right now, but if I set that as far as it goes, just with hand pressure, and then put that in, I can see whether this is likely to be tight or loose in there, and you can check the fit of the chip breaker against the pin, and that might then influence your decision as to whether you want to bend that down or even this one off a little bit. And I just want to bear that in mind. Just check this before I make a decision on how to adapt that. And actually it's not a bad fit, so I think what I'm going to do, I'm just going to file those two on the back, and then I'll give this one a tap until we get no more of that sound. Now this material is very soft at the back, so it will file very easily and quickly. I don't want to do too much on it. But once I'm happy that there's a fairly similar land there and it's not just a sharp point, I can check that again, see whether that is still making a noise. It is. So the cap is very small, so it's not going to take much of a whack to get rid of that. So this is not the best equipped workshop at the moment, but instead of an anvil, I've got a lump hammer just nipped up in the vise there. And I'm giving this just a tap on the corner. And I will check that frequently to make sure I don't go too far. And now that sound has gone. And so I know that it's touching nicely on these corners. Now, there may need to be later on some more adjustment here or then to the pin in the die, but that's as good as we can get it for now. Now, apologies for the long video again, but there's quite a bit to do to get the blade and the chip breaker ready for first use. But as long as you take your time and get this stage right, then subsequent honing of the blade is a fairly quick process. You might not even need to go down to the coarsest stone, and until you wear back the bevel so far that you run out of ura here, you don't need to touch the back again, except to just remove the burr at the end of sharpening. At some point this will wear away, and when you no longer have this ura and you're into the hollow grind, then you've got another job to do, and that's tapping out the blade until you can restore the back. That of course is a bit of a job, but it's going to be a long time now before I get that far. You don't remove a lot of this hard steel when you hone the blade, unless, as I say, unless you've chipped it. So that should be pretty good for quite some time. In the next video, I will go through the process of fitting the blade to the block. And again, there's quite a lot going on there to get that right. Now, at this point, it is very easy to make a bit of a mess of it. And you can get the blade going through too far. On this particular die, it's got Tsutsumi there. I'll go into all of that later. It's very easy to damage the die if you're whacking it in with a hammer. All sorts of things can go wrong. So there's a fair bit to pick up in order to be able to fit the blade successfully to the die, and I will do that in the next video. So thanks very much for watching, and bye for now.